The microphones are on. Great. So welcome to our panelists, and I will briefly introduce each, and each panelist will then have 5 minutes and 5 slides, a bit Pecha Kucha style, to introduce some ideas in their work and ideas they're interested in discussing today. Matt Eckelman, to my right, is an assistant professor in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department here at Northeastern. He has aspects of his career that I was unaware of until I read your bio at this moment. He has served as the Chief Technical Officer of Sustainability A to Z, which is an engineering consulting firm. He has also served on the advisory board of the Resources Optimization Initiative in India. He's previously worked in the Massachusetts State Executive Office for Environmental Affairs, as well as a firm or an initiative called Design That Matters, a product design company, and wonderfully served in the Peace Corps as a science instructor in southern Nepal. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
Natalie Beauvais is a senior associate at Kleinfelder Associates. She has served as an architect and planner for Harvard University for Sasaki Associates, and she currently is leading the climate change vulnerability study for the city of Cambridge. Welcome, Natalie. And Nigel Jacob, wonderful to have you here. He is the co-founder of the Office of New Urban Mechanics, an advisor to Mayo Menino for Emerging Technologies, and is a fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Public Action at Bennington College. So I look forward to our conversation, and Natalie will be giving the first presentation.
Okay. Do I control the slides here?
Your, I guess you can sit there.
Oh, I can go there.
Your choice, really. Yours forward, backwards, and there's a pointer.
Okay. So I was asked to present metrics about sustainability. And I thought that most of you would be totally aware of the sustainability metrics for buildings. And I would bring 2 different scales, which would be the micro or the nano and the macro, which is what I'm dealing with at this time. And also think there's a new paradigm, which is about moving from mitigation to adaptation and preparedness. And this is where Sandy changed everything. Not in the science of what we knew about sustainability and climate change, but about making it real and really making us reconsider how we design our cities and how the building context is also evolving and is bringing a new understanding to it. One aspect is certainly about heat, how it's changing. And heat, the metrics for heat are degree, humidity, and heating degree days. And a lot of cities are, in fact, doing urban heat island. New York has a wonderful study. But it means what is the context for your building? And now, and it's going to changing rapidly, is Boston is moving from where you spend more energy cooling your building than heating it. And that's a change. And we're in trouble when the most visionary institution in a country are the insurance company and the army, which are the 2 institutions or group that don't question climate change. It's part of their planning, of their budget. And, we don't see those numbers because they're internal numbers, but it's real. So this is a graphic from the Army Corps, in fact, for a project that Kleinfelder did for Camp Edwards, which in fact take as a fact that the temperature within the next 50 years in Boston is going to be close to Carolina, and there's 2 scenarios when it's a low emission and high emission, but these are fact that means that you should design your building differently within this area, within a changing context. The other one is obviously water, and water as sea level rise, that's measured in terms of feet. This is a study recently published by the Boston Harbor Associates, and that was also in partnership with the city of Boston. And again, this is looking at different scenarios of low emission and high emission. The West Coast is also looking through a similar phenomenon where, now bridge design are done to take into account 3 feet of sea level rise. That has a tremendous impact. Precipitation, in sense, too much of it, not enough. This is calculated in inch per hour. Even extreme events are inches of rain per 15 minutes. Then again, if you look at current regulation in the state and in most cities, we're based on historic data, and that totally underestimate the way you design your project. So again, that's shifting what are the regional implications to the very specific of the science and how it translates into the design of building. The other one is about air quality. And again, climate change has an impact on that. This is a study again done for the city of New York that calculate ozone pollution, parts per billions. The federal safe air standard have a standard of 35 micrograms of particle per cubic meters of air. Salt Lake City made the news recently because they're way under that threshold because of inversion. And again, for people who have worked in China, what it means, again, for the design of the building, you have air filters for your buildings that purify the air. I'm thinking, this is almost like being on the moon. You cannot open the window. And what's going to mean also for the design of our building if we have days where the air is at risk for people with disease? When do we need to filter it, and how does it impact? I thought I would be original with this slide talking about the metrics of dollar, but there were also already plenty of discussion about that issue. But again, this is where you take the science that, let's say you assume that we're all in the prediction and scenarios, but to overestimate or underestimate, for example, your extreme events, your water flow, has a tremendous impact on your whole infrastructure while you're rebuilding it. And that's the key issue. That's a key issue and challenge for cities. The issue in terms of dollars, and this is where Sandy is changing that, is insurance companies are not paying back. FEMA is reconsidering how they're going to finance that, and what does it mean in a country where, my numbers might be wrong, but I think 75% of the population are within 50 miles of the seashore. So this is where we'll have to deal with a new paradigm in the sense of the implication. The challenge, what I'm doing, working with the science of climate change and those new metrics, is how to translate that into design and how to take those deep reports, that have a lot of data, charts, and table, and link it to the reality of the city. So this is what we're doing for the city of Cambridge, is we're taking the data about science and linking it to the GIS. And also trying to bring people, and I didn't talk about environmental justice, but about equal access to quality of life in a secure environment, and trying to use GIS as the tool to link the census data and the science of climate change, and provide the tool for designer when they get the context of a project to be able to integrate it within the concept of a rethought urban sustainable environment.
Wonderful, thank you. And we'll have questions after our panel presents. Thank you, Natalie, very much. Nigel, that's forwards, backwards, and pointer.
Great. Okay, great. So I run a civic innovation incubator and R&D lab in the city of Boston called the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. Whoops, I'm so used to running from here. I should just keep this away. So one of the points of departure for our work is that the mayor and, frankly, mayors all over the country are trying to understand how do they take an innovative look at how city services are delivered and how cities expand and grow, and how we watch and incorporate the data that's being generated by and within cities. And so the approach that we've created in Boston is to create an R&D lab that focuses on these issues. So on the one hand, we focus on enabling the residents of Boston, and frankly anybody, not just in Boston, but for the sake of argument, the people living in Boston, to become civic innovators themselves and to develop a range of different experimental projects that can positively impact the quality of life in the community. And we have the same kind of interaction with city personnel, trying to work with them to make them entrepreneurs in developing these interesting experiments and projects. So in particular, in this instance, we do a lot of work, I mean, beyond this, but we do a lot of work at the intersection where civic life meets city services. And typically this has meant that we've done a lot of exploration in how digital technology, mobile devices can be used, again, not only, but how they can be used to enhance and enable engagement in a very broad range of ways. It's important to note that our mayor is very his entire philosophy is about, in terms of local government, is that it should be there to help people, to support people. And so that's the same flavor of innovation that we pursue in our office. It is entirely focused on the value proposition to the public. And so over the past 3-4 years, we've been exploring the space around how technology can enable that. So the first experiment that we ran, Citizens Connect there in 2009, was really premised around the idea as to whether or not the public, even in principle, would be interested in first having a sense of trust in government, in that they would be reporting requests for service. So you see potholes, graffiti, other sort of infrastructure sorts of issues, and then be able to report that to the city and have the city fix those things quickly. And so we've been running that continuously, and it's had a variety of upgrades over the years, but it's been a tremendous boon in terms of providing a lot of motivation, both on the public side and the government side, in terms of looking at new kinds of ways to be enhancing this interaction between public and the public sector. The one on the upper right there was actually an interesting discovery. So our entire methodology is to use design research to look at how people use technology to enhance their civic lives. And so when we say people, we don't only mean the public, we also mean people that are working for the city, obviously. And so when we started looking at the data that was being generated by these technologies, we were pleasantly surprised to learn that the top 5% of users, who accounted at that point for at least 80% of the total volume of requests for service into the city, all worked for the city, which we hadn't anticipated. And we were pleasantly surprised to see that they actually had smartphones in their pockets. But what we began to look at, when we dove into this, we began to find that the technology itself was actually designed in such a way, I mean, it was designed around usability and engagement, so that the public works crews that were going out and fixing potholes and all these other issues, it essentially did 80% of what they needed to be able to do their job. And so we created a platform specifically for them, and since then we've been able to essentially roll it out without any kind of training. What's interesting there is that because we do typically think about engagement primarily from the perspective of the public, and less so about the people that work for the city. And our sense is that has created this it reinforces the power imbalance, where you've got people in the grassroots that are trying to affect change, but government still remains faceless and sort of a big concrete bureaucracy in our case. But the idea here, by introducing these very lightweight tools that encourage the direct collaboration between the public and the people that are going to be fixing these issues, it provides this opportunity for two-way communication. So we also, as true experimentalists, we also have a fair number of failures or not quite successes. So this one here in the lower right was one of those. This was an experiment in using QR codes to enable people to tag the built environment, so to be able to more accurately report issues, so that there was no ambiguity around the GPS location or the address that you submitted. We would know there was a specific sort of road level issue, maybe a traffic box that had graffiti on it, whatever it was. It just failed. No, we tried it. People didn't like using the QR codes. They're kind of a clunky technology, and so we have retired that one. Another one directly beside that we have also been experimenting with is the use of SMS, text-based messaging, to enable people to have much the same kind of functionality where they can express, where they can tell the city what's wrong in their communities using text. That's been also sort of a struggling project in that the usability of the technology is such that it isn't a very seamless experience, and so that one is sort of in development. But one of the things that a couple of more interesting or more recent projects, Street Bump had its origins in the mayor was very active. He's often one of our he is one of those top 5% reporters, the mayor. And every day he has a very long drive into work. He lives in Hyde Park. And so his sense, he would have been communicating long before my time at City Hall, but he had been communicating that the driving experience can often be really bad in the city, and that if there was only some way to capture the data of that ride, sort of the rideability, in a quality-based way, that we could actually do something about the road conditions. And so based on that intuition, we tested the concept with a few other, with some focus groups here in the city, and we developed this technology called Street Bump, which essentially does what the mayor's intuition was. It uses the accelerometers on your smartphone. My smartphone is almost always in front of me, but it uses the accelerometers to automatically detect, as you're driving along a road, the roughness or the smoothness of the ride, and then we'll communicate that directly to the city for fixing. So that one's in active development. And we began finding also a lot of other people in other cities want to be able to use the same technology. Obviously, there's a lot of transit in and out, or travel in and out of the city over a given day, and people often don't know when they're actually in Boston. I mean, if you think about sort of Brookline, for example, or into Cambridge. And so it was pretty clear to us that we need to create a mechanism by which people could automatically submit requests for service that would just go to the right city, whichever city that you're in. And so that's what Citizens Connect, or Commonwealth Connect is about. It's about erasing the boundaries and sort of enhancing the usability of those kinds of technologies. The last one there, Citizens Connect 4.0, is going to be this direct person-to-person communication between the person that is sending a service request into the city and the person that's actually going to be fixing it. So there'll just be direct dialogue between you and the public works person that's going to be fixing it. So it's going to be a really interesting experiment to see. So we've tested a little bit, and I think people are interested in having that level of dialogue with the city. So that's a newer one. I just realized I had a whole bunch of other slides here. One of the interesting things with these technologies is that as much as we are trying to enable greater communication between government and public, we also find that inevitably the same kind of infrastructure allows direct community, interconnectivity across the community. And we found lots of really interesting anecdotes. This was an interesting story here on the right in which a citizen or a resident had reported a possum that was in her trash can. And she reported into the city saying, possum in my trash can, I don't know if it's alive or dead, I'm not sure what to do, please help. And one of her neighbors, who had just downloaded Citizens Connect and had just started using it that day, sort of on a lark, saw the request come in and walked over to look in the garbage can. It was in front of her neighbor's house, and somebody tipped it over, and the possum scurried off, and she sort of bid goodnight to the possum. But in this way, we're able to directly enable resident-to-resident communication and direct problem solving, because she did exactly what the public works people would have done, just tip the canister over. I've told you a little about Street Bump, and I think I've covered all of that. So I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Nigel. We'll have questions towards the end. That was wonderful. All right. Matt, sorry, that's forward, backwards, and pointer. Right.
Okay, so I'm from the engineering side of things, and this will be a picture that's familiar to many of you. This is the era of urbanization we're in now, and the urbanization isn't just taking place in the middle of cities, as you see here in Shanghai, old neighborhoods being taken out and being replaced with high-rise buildings and commercial space. as well. But there's a lot of urbanization taking place on the periphery. The sprawl of cities and the growth of city boundaries is striking these days. And one of the most compelling things I've read recently was an article about the pace of urbanization using remote sensing satellite data, which said that, in effect, by 2030, we're going to add something like 1.5 million square kilometers of new city to the world. So what does that mean? That's about an area the size of Mongolia. So imagine starting now and building a city the size of Mongolia in 20 years or even 15 years. So that's the scope, that's the pace of urbanization taking place now. And it presents a major problem for engineers and all of us in trying to mitigate the environmental implications and impacts of that urbanization and those processes. So engineers would look at this and say, wow, look at all the opportunities for structural engineering. There's a lot of business to be done in this kind of area, and in fact, many engineers are doing that. But the big push on engineering is, with many disciplines now, is understanding the systemic effects, trying to couple, all of the engineered systems that need to take place in a city like this, and understand how they interact with the natural systems that they are being overlaid on top of. So this is a cautionary tale of what happens when you ignore those kinds of systemic effects. So this is almost what the 2008 sailing events in the Olympics looked like. This was the city of Qingdao. Not too long before the Olympics took place, there's a massive algae bloom that happened in the bay there. Right here is where the sailing events were going to be. So this is a case of eutrophication. This is when too many nutrients fall into the urban watershed and cause algae to bloom, to grow too much and basically overtake the entire ecosystem. And we understand the base idea behind what causes this. It's too many nutrients from agriculture, from automobile emissions, from all sorts of sources. So we understand the point source effects of that. What we don't really understand from even a measurement point of view yet is how they all interact. What's the total watershed effects of these nutrients and other pollutants getting into urban areas, and what kinds of effects are they going to have like this? So this is an extreme case, obviously, but here in Boston we have the same sort of thing. We have an issue of too much phosphorus in the Charles River watershed, which periodically causes algae blooms and makes it so that we can't enjoy the Charles as much as we would like to in terms of recreation. So this is also familiar, and the speaker this morning had many beautiful examples of green infrastructure and best management practices that engineers and landscape architects are working to install in cities all over the place. And from an engineering point of view, we have a good sense of how these mitigate nitrogen and phosphorus flows, mainly from stormwater, from getting into a bay like Qingdao Bay there. So we understand how they work in demonstration plants, in isolation, but we're still trying to figure out on an urban scale where these should be put in to optimize their effects and optimize their benefits, and how all of these different pollutants interact. So I'm here from the science point of view to tell you that we know very little, in fact, and more data would be nice to have. So this is a kind of typical picture about our attempt to collect information. This is the city of Geneva, and the dots that you see are measurements that were taken around the city on copper and zinc pollutants. So copper and zinc are both bioactive metals, so they cause toxicity to aquatic organisms. And so you don't really want them in your rivers and bays if you can avoid it. But we don't really know where all of the copper and zinc is coming from. We have a good sense. You can see these WTP boxes around. Those are wastewater treatment plants. So we know the point sources pretty well. But the non-point sources, the distributed sources of pollution, are very difficult to track and to try to figure out. So some of the more interesting efforts that are going on in this area now are taking measurements of pollutants and looking at the isotopic ratios within those measurements, and then we can track. We can say, well, this came from an automobile. This molecule came from a wastewater treatment plant, and this one came from someone's roof. They put a bunch of copper on their roof, and it's since been leaching out over time. We can tell where it came from. So that helps us plan and mitigate those effects and maybe design our buildings and our cityscapes in a way that we can prevent that kind of pollution, non-point source, from getting in. So I'd say Geneva is a resource plentiful kind of city with a lot of ability to collect these kinds of measurements. In most cities around the world, we basically have no idea where the pollution is coming from, and even how much of it is there in many areas of the world. I've been talking mostly about direct effects, and another big push in engineering these days is to understand the indirect effects of all of the construction, all of the urbanization that's taking place in our world today. So a lot of the direct effects you see in terms of best management practices are beautiful cityscapes and reduction in stormwater volumes and so on. But there are a lot of co-benefits and co-costs that also come along with this. So in my work and many others, we try to understand what are the benefits from good design in terms of less resource-intensive construction processes, less materials that you need, right? Less use of energy in buildings in the urban environment for mitigating heat island effect, for example. So the reduction in energy, for example, means you use electricity, and electricity is a major source of nutrients in the form of nitrous oxides that then fall and cause eutrophication. So you have many different sources, and we're trying to solve the same problems. And the goal for engineers and I think our partnerships with other scientists and designers is to link these direct and indirect effects in a way that we can design better.
Great. Thank you, Matt, Natalie, and Nigel. Really quite interesting and informative perspectives, and I will say quite a range of perspectives. This panel in particular, in attempting to create a discussion around science and technology in relation to design, has a lot of ground to cover. We have quite distinctive perspectives and disciplinary backgrounds. So I'd like to approach our conversation first by noting a couple of common points that I heard in each of your presentations, and perhaps having a conversation around that, and then pulling out some individual points that I heard in your presentations. Great. The issue of engagement and the role of science and technology in engagement is obviously a driving force in how we understand our cities, how we make our cities, manage our cities. But engagement has it has a lot of baggage. It has many challenges associated with it and many ways to interpret the notion of engagement. Who is engaged? How are they engaged? So 3 aspects of that I'd love to probe with you. First, engagement of citizens to their city. And clearly Nigel's work is related to that, but I think also the understanding that citizens have of their own personal actions towards climate change, and the understanding that citizens have in doing something about it in terms of participating in anything from best management practices to even understanding the impact of urbanization at a global scale, even though they live at a local scale. Secondly, engagement of the city within its greater regional environment, so the sort of socio-ecological perspective that cities are part of a larger, whether we want it or not, directly or indirectly, the city is engaged in much larger complex systems, and we have to understand that. We have to use science and technology to, if not manage that, at least understand that situation. And then thirdly, access. When we talk about science and technology, who has access to these tools? Often it ends up being educated professionals, practitioners. It's not often available to the everyday citizen. Increasingly, social media is available across a broader range of citizens, but even then, we find, for example, districts where smartphones aren't as available to some citizens, and how do they participate in new urban mechanics, or how do they understand climate change? So, engagement, citizen to city, city to region, sort of socio-ecologically, and the issue of access. Thoughts?
No, I'm happy to start. I think that we're still at the beginning, I think, of understanding the science of engagement and what that actually means. And I think it is a baggage-laden term, and it means a lot of different things in different contexts. And so one of the challenges before us, I think, is to understand what that continuum of engagement is, participation and so on, and understanding what the different mechanisms that are most effective at those different points along the continuum. Obviously, there's everything. Social media is in there, but so are sort of in-person meetings, and understanding what are the sweet spots for each of those different modes, I think, is something that is still not really well understood. On the technology side, clearly, we're all just on the early days of understanding what these different mechanisms, when they're best used and misused. I think there's been 20 years of badly deployed uses of technology to encourage engagement in many ways, and that's often left a bad taste in the mouths of the participants and the people that were also deploying it. And so we're trying more methodically, kind of really in a science, data-driven way, to understand what are the elements that enable certain deployments to be more effective than others. To give you an example, one of the things that we're looking at in particular is the psychology of engagement. What is it that people are getting out of the experience? What are the incentives, sort of both inherently and sort of intrinsically or extrinsically? And so we're using. There isn't a good word for this, but for lack of a better term, game dynamics, to explore what those different pieces are, to figure out, are there intrinsic ways or intrinsic motivations that we can enhance through different kinds of methodologies and so on.
So I'm really optimistic on this side too, both from the point of view of citizen science, and using citizens to collect science about urban environments and urbanization. And also to use this kind of technology and distributed information to push data about people's actions to them so they understand the implications of what's going on. So there's one of my favorite examples is this long-running project about tracking wildlife in cities, in particular birds. So it's been going on for many, many years now. And every day people who are participating in the study go home, write down what do they see in their backyards, urban backyards, and they send it out to the scientific consortium, and they have this very rich, spatially coded information about different populations of wildlife over time. And it's one of the richest resources for us to understand how the changing pollution levels and kind of form of cities has really impacted wildlife. So.
And I think there's the challenge, or when it's a win-win, I mean, this is working, obviously. The challenge is when there are trade-offs. And I think this is where sustainability has been lagging way behind. And this is where I'm finding out also that fear sells much better than vision, And the issue is that for the city of Cambridge, we're struggling a bit with that in the sense that we're collecting data. We have an expert advisory panel made of scientists from MIT, BU. I mean, we don't have no one from Northeastern yet, but and we thought that they would push us to get more science, and we realized there was a lot of frustration. I mean, fact for climate change, I've been there, or for sustainability, as a matter of fact, I've been there for years. And I read from an environmental activist, I forget who said, we made the big mistake to think that people would be rational and made, the difficult choice, And so our expert advisory panel say, let's go with the data. We're fine. Just go to the community and say they're going to be flooded and it's going to be terrible. We say we can't, So this is where now we feel that we need to bring the science to the community, because bottom line is, if we, for example, that's not the case, but in some city, I mean, Boston, any South Shore community, are you going to prevent housing, for example, in basement, what does it mean from a real estate point of view? And we need people to vote for it. It's going to be a zoning amendment. So we found that, well, we need to back that up, and maybe we'll need 1 or 2 storms, and for people not to be able to get their insurance back. So I think that this is that mix of, at some point, too much data won't change the bottom line decision, and it will be other facts. So this is I don't know what's going to be. We're going to experiment. We're going to go to those public meetings, but we realize it's an interesting mix of science, politics, and money.
I mean, I would add into that. And I think that by and large, when you look over the last 5 years with the economic crisis and all the work that's being done in fields like behavioral economics and behavioral psychology, I think we're beginning to understand that we're not rational actors, right? This was largely a myth or a hopeful aspect of the Age of Enlightenment, right? That we would, by providing people with better data, they make better decisions. There's lots of biases based into it, or sort of loaded into that. And so the challenge for us, as a society, is to try to figure out how do we create an architecture of choice that is based on those biases, so that people are able to make decisions in an effective way, but just throwing data at people has a long and glorious history of not working.
That's a great point, that there's been a sort of certainly capitalization but politicization of information, of science, of technology. Increasingly, there's absolutely no way to talk about some important scientific areas such as climate change or the role of information platforms in city management without being political. And in fact, in your role in the mayor's office, you could be assigned a political role. However, I suspect in listening to you, your larger interests, of course, are in citizenship. That's a fascinating point, and it brings up to me the sense of shifting identities and roles in urban management, urban design, urban thinking. Matt, you mentioned the citizen scientist. Natalie, you mentioned the sort of scientist urban advisor role, and Nigel, you mentioned the mayor technologist. So these, if not new roles, they're perhaps newly important, that we are placing value in the voice of science, the tools of technology in our city management, our city making. Are these dangerous roles? Are these positive roles? Is the mayor technologist the new kingpin in the city? Is the citizen scientist the new disruptive factor in the city? How do these new identities impact our approach to urbanism?
I think it's about power. I mean, there's no shortage of advocacy and advisory. But I live in Europe a couple of years, and when I left the U.S. for Europe, U.S. was way ahead in terms of sustainability. When I was shocked when I was in Europe. Then I came back to the U.S., and the European community voted a pretty aggressive agenda about climate change. And now it's amazing. I mean, you work in Geneva, and it's way ahead in terms of implementation. And in the U.S., I mean, there are two democracies, and in the U.S. it's very democratic. But, you need at some point, I mean, from a sustainability point of view, some kind of centralization is very efficient, and because someone needs to impose it, it's painful decision. And in the U.S., maybe it will happen. I think it will happen through insurance and money, because this is the strength here. But what you need is one powerful force that will be the mover and the shaker, and a very decentralized decision-making process make it very difficult to adopt difficult decisions. I mean, that's an observation. I'm sure there are conflicting opinion or things, but I think that's what we're struggling with.
In that sense, you're suggesting that science becomes, not that it wasn't already, but it has an automatic authority that comes with it, that now it's newly political and we hope newly economic.
Well, there must be someone who's can not impose a vision, but has the will to make the regulation change or things, because out of goodwill, it's not happening. I mean, and sometimes it's more data. So I think I noticed in Europe, the Kyoto Protocol, for example, was to be, on a voluntary basis. I'm Canadian from Canada, remove themselves from the Kyoto Protocol because they have strong economic forces that makes them not meeting that. So who will, and there's plenty of environmental activists in Canada that push for that, but it's still not happening. So there's, at some point, someone needs to make the decision. And in a democracy, I mean, it would be the government, but, you need to be empowered. And I don't know what's your experience in Geneva for that, or if...
Yes, it wasn't my work in Geneva, but emblematic. So of course, I'm very troubled and distressed by the politicization of science and the advent of truthiness as a metric for, is this data believable? Do I believe this data? Well, you measured it, so it's not really a matter of belief. That's my scientist's point of view. But the fact is that it's very, very difficult, to your point about access, it's very difficult for people who don't have access to, let's say, university libraries, or don't have the education or training to understand, what does copper and zinc levels mean? How do I even interpret that information? Why is it important? So I see lots of opportunities, actually, for using science and engineering in terms of access to the public. And I think, actually, we were talking some time ago about just putting up signs. Now we have a lot of real-time sensor ability, so we can measure things like pollution levels or water flow, and we can display that to citizens, so they just get used to seeing scientific measurement around. Oh, the river's high today, or oh, there's a large flow, or there's a lot of suspended sediment, or whatever it is. And just having the signs up there, I think, forwards the goal of getting people more engaged in science and using science in the political process.
I think we refer to that as social networking with your environment.
Yeah.
I think part of the challenge, though, is that once science leaves sort of the technical realm and moves into the social policy realm, it becomes very tricky, because we're no longer talking simply about the data or the science. We're talking about our response to this. And that is a very different notion. And I think part of the challenge is that we often describe or prescribe particular responses to particular pieces of data. And I think that's often where things get jammed, is that it's a very top-down, we often use a very top-down way of thinking about how to roll these changes through in a community sense, or in a sort of broader social sense. And there's been a pretty extensive change in the way that, in terms of like local community governance, right? How do communities want to govern themselves over the last many years? And so I think part of the work that needs to be done is to understand, how do we enable communities to develop those responses in an intelligent way, in an informed way, with support, and so that they're making appropriate decisions, but there is a sense of agency involved on behalf of the community. And so that's much harder. But I think that there's lots we can learn from design in terms of in design science as to how do you, like I referred to choice architectures, right? This was a bunch of work that was done by Cass Sunstein, and it is very much about how do you set up these infrastructures by which you're not guiding people to a particular answer, but you are giving people a set of design constraints in terms of how they think about how they respond to these issues. And so I think that, in a democracy, that coming up with a more sophisticated approach to that kind of like governance, like community governance innovation, I think is a big missing piece of our toolkit.
In a way, it's the difference between raw data and information, and technology is the tool that lets us get from facts to action, to informed action. Information has a reading already inherent in it, hopefully one that's not too biased, but one that allows people to make those decisions. It makes me think of a software application that one of my colleagues here has suggested that I'll let him talk about if he wants to later, but it essentially is on your iPad, allows multiple visualizations of a proposed environmental or architectural or urban condition, hopefully without bias, but it allows the everyday citizen or the designer, the manager, to get a sense of the possibilities.
There's a learning moment there, because one of the things that you can do with these tools is architect them in such a way that people develop intuition as to why things are set up the way that they are. And so it's not just imposed on you from the top, but that they can understand if there's regulations and zoning rules and so on, they're there for a reason. And then if part of these experiences with the technology are designed in such a way that they can understand that, and and they can explore their way through it, as opposed to simply having, a list of regulatory constraints on how people think about these things.
It would be fascinating to develop an app that shows you what the environment that you're standing in would look like without those regulations.
That's a great idea. We actually did some experimentation with this a couple of years ago, where we wanted there was a building development that was going to be happening in a section of town. I'll leave the names out to preserve everybody's and to keep things amicable. But there was a big building project going on, and the developers weren't doing really well with the community. And in particular, there was the question of how to program a particular park, which should be in that park. It was a new park as part of the community benefits package. And when we watched the community process around what should be in that park, it was acrimonious. There was lots of abutters. There was all kinds of entrenched positions in the room. It was very clear. And so we developed a game, essentially, that allowed people to learn about why things had to be the way that they were. So you started out with it was sort of like a 3D immersive environment, and you could see the space, and then you could drop park elements into the space. So you could drop a jungle gym and a dog lot or tot lot and a dog run, and you could understand, and you could also see the price tag associated with as you drop these elements into the park. So people very quickly got an intuitive sense as to the cost. So it's not just a tallied list with a total at the bottom, but in a very intuitive sense they understand, oh great, there was a group of people that wanted a pool, and they could quickly see the pool blows their budget. But also we built in the policy constraints so that dog lots or dog runs and tot lots there's a minimum distance between the two and a minimum elevation and so on. And people, you would watch them trying to drag things into the space, and then you would stop the action and say, great, let's talk about this. And in this way we're able to, you watch people have these aha moments in a very intuitive sense about why things were, what the limitations were, and then they just adapted to them. So I think there's a lot that can be done there in terms of user experience design.
Great. Let's talk about water for a moment, water rise and associated environmental and urban impacts. Natalie, you mentioned the factoid that perhaps 75% of our, was it North American or global populations live within 15
in the
miles?
U.S.
In the U.S. 75% of our population lives within 15 miles of a coast. 50. That makes more sense. Okay. Good. Well, I was going to attribute that fact to you and then look it up later.
That has to be checked. I'm not sure about the exact.
A lot of people live near the coast, and this is a concern on a number of fronts. What is the role of science and technology in determining what is going on? What are the metrics of providing some levels of not solution but resolution? What is the role of science and technology in creating a basis of communication around these issues? Do you, in your work personally, have a sort of a hope and a concern about the role, how you use science and technology relative to coastal cities and the future of coastal urbanization? Is there Natalie, I'll start with you. Is there an intention in the climate change vulnerability study, for example, that you're doing, that it will directly impact how we move through cities or make cities or manage cities, or is it simply using science to figure stuff out and then it gets packaged and put on a shelf?
I think it cannot. I mean, it just cannot be ignored. And I mean, that's such a reality. And I looked at history, and I think water always has been a challenge, I mean, for cities. Cities were close to water because they were port, and obviously transportation. Also, marshland were dry because they brought disease. I mean, we forgot about, water and disease, and now it's an issue. And density forces sewer and stormwater to be separated. And again, you must have the numbers, but the amount of untreated water in the world, I think it's more than 75% of the water is untreated. And, I mean, this is just shocking. I mean, So that's going to be an issue. And I look at the state of Vermont, who was very, in the 70s, adopted environmental laws for zoning and things. And I was working on a small school, the Vermont Law School, in Vermont, and they had water regulation, and you're there, and suddenly they had the maximum water allowance that was given to them in the 80s, and now they wanted to build a gym, and they were short of their water allowance, so they were thinking of purchasing the water right from the high school, who was not using that. I feel like in the Middle East, and I'm in Vermont, So I think that water is going to be managed very tightly. And we didn't discuss about the link with water and energy. It's not so much an issue here in the East, but on the West Coast, 40% of energy is used for agriculture, for pumping water. I mean, in France, they had to shut down their nuclear plant because there was a drought and they could not cool the system. So I think this is where I think water is going to be it's so integrated to all the system of how we live and how it's going to translate into how you design a specific building. And then Australia, of course, is at the forefront of zoning regulation for that.
I think that one of the challenges of living in cities is that most people have no understanding of what the natural systems are in which they are embedded, and so I think there's a tremendous amount that can be done in terms of making those systems more legible and understandable, and just giving people an awareness that they are there. I mean, I did some work a couple of years ago, kind of a citizen science kind of focus, and we began finding that there were kids in Dorchester that were maybe had grown up half a mile from the bay, had never seen the beach, had never seen seashells or so on. So needless to say, they had no idea about watersheds or sort of any of the sort of the natural, the sort of ecosystem supports that in which they're living. And so I think that there's a lot that can be done in terms of design and technology to make that transparent to people, to give people cues as to where water is flowing, and even whether it's the water in your house or the water that you see when you go outside. I think that cities as complex systems, as complicated and complex systems, that they're immensely misunderstood, and so I think there's a lot that can be done to make them legible, and also, again, sort of to this issue of giving people a sense of agency as to how do you actually respond to that. So you're making informed decisions.
And it seems that sense of agency could be as high tech as you want it to be. For example, sensor systems and social networking with the environment, to extremely low tech, the spray painting of this water goes to the bay in front of storm drains is. I think that's probably been one of the most effective educational tools for the public in terms of urbanized watersheds in the last couple of decades.
Yep, I agree.
So one of my favorite things to do going around Boston on the T especially is they'll often have these pictures of what it used to be like. What was Boston like before we arrived? And basically engineered a city out of a, flat mud puddle. Just seeing those pictures, having pictures up in the park, or you go to, any tea stop around, it's so eye-opening to see, where we came from and how we've engineered things over time, and just how the populace has grown and shifted. Even just that as a tool for awareness, I think is so effective. I'm always surprised, when I see those old pictures of Boston or any city, to get a sense of the historical context of where we are.
There's a great organization in New York called the Center for Urban Pedagogy, and their entire mission is about, which the name is great, but they are all about making the various systems in which we're partaking, more, as I say, more legible and sort of visible, and also giving people sort of the analytical and skills to be able to understand what it is that you're looking at, when you see things happening in your communities, whether it's, law-based, sort of legislative changes, or they're sort of just the technological changes to the physical infrastructure, or natural changes over a period of time. And so I think there's a lot to be done to make people more generally aware as to how cities work at all these different levels.
Using science as a foundation and technology as both a message and a medium.
Yep, exactly.
I think that, I really like what you said about bringing, kids to the ocean and things. I think that in some ways, where design played a role is to bring the poetry and the attachment,
Yeah.
in the sense that if you don't care for the land, and again, when we have more of the population being urban, why would you care for water? Why would you care to preserve the forest? And I think, and it's a really North American thing. I mean, in some ways, to be attached to the national parks, and there's that sense with nature. But if we're losing it, how could people want us to design with nature if you don't experience it? This is why I was so interested in the example of Shanghai, because in Asia, it's a totally different relationship with nature. I mean, this is, it's a what's the cue, basically, culturally, that will make people feel attachment to that. And I was talking to a colleague from Singapore, and she said, well, what's the attachment for me is my community, my parents. It's, I'll care about sustainability once I take care of my family, my extended family, and then that's going to be next. So, and we were discussing, well, so then maybe the cue is about the generation and what you're going to hand out, So, and I think this is where design, might succeed, where science, brought us to a certain point, but we're stuck there. And so that's my hope. And this is when I see something like that, I'm always looking for a design project to make it visible,
We now need a culturalization of the role of science and technology.
Yeah. One of the interesting ways that this plays out, I think, is in the language that we use. I think that as we enter this period of crisis, and as we've been there for a while in various ways, that we often use the language of efficiency and effectiveness, which makes sense because we have to solve certain problems. But it also, we end up talking less about the beauty and like the synchronicities of city living and so on. And so I think that it tends to, we end up using two sets of language, right, that also have a series of values attached to them. And so I think that I think science can do this also, a sort of a judicious use of science and design science can help us integrate those two modes of thinking and again also like the concepts that we're using, so that one of my interesting observations has been so IBM Smart Cities has created this campaign over the last several years, which is all about focusing on the systemic elements of cities. But if you looked at those, they've changed the sense. But if you looked at some of those early advertisements, there was no people in the smart city. Right? The city was an abstraction, it was just systems. And so I think that is the danger, right? The danger is that we end up talking just about the logical, sort of the infrastructure and not the livability of cities. And of course, they're deeply interrelated, but I think that like when you talk about this issue about sort of trying to connect both your family concerns with broader sort of sustainability issues, that's an example of that, right? That we're struggling to integrate those two.
That is absolutely fascinating. And the smart cities market is forecast to grow at be something like $14 billion within
right.
several years. So how to humanize that?
Right.
And what is the public face of that from the perspective of those who are paying for it?
Mm-hmm.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. I have a bit of a game to play with you. I'd like to throw out there a couple of events that have happened in Boston over the last several years, and just a very short answer. From your perspective, what was the role in science and technology in those events, either helping recover for them, helping cause them, failing spectacularly during them? Just super short answer. Okay. The Occupy movement in Boston didn't start here, but was very active here.
So I'm going to take a bye. I lived in Connecticut during I just moved here a year ago, so I'm not sure.
So I certainly think that we saw a lot of organization around the Occupy movement using technology, using social media, using a variety of media for that matter. And there was a lot of even the governance of what was happening in the camps, I think, was all done. A lot of it was done online.
Yep. Great.
Yeah, I think it was very successful with creating momentum with a new set of media. So that I thought was really interesting. And also shift how we saw the public space, and how they could be occupied, which was kind of interesting as well.
Excellent. Do any of you feel that there's a new sense of 1% in terms, or 99% in terms of environmental and sustainability interest, not just economic, or no? That the 99% in expressing a sense of solidarity through the Occupy movement, did that have other dimensions that we could say were sustainability oriented?
So I think, in fact, that's been part of the criticism of the Occupy movement, that it didn't have one agenda item, that it didn't have the top 5 list of what they wanted to have done, because there was a lot packed into there, right? There were sort of people that were environmental advocates. There was also people that were pro-marijuana. There was people that were trying to get rid of all the jails in the United States. So it was like a kind of cultural free-for-all where all these elements that have been sort of nagging at the edges of our consciousness over the last 100 years kind of came out all at once, and it was really messy, and people ended up being frustrated by it. But I think we have to have some way of airing these things, and so I think that hopefully we'll see more sort of kind of more outgrowth of that activity that is kind of a little more goal-oriented.
And perhaps technology as a digital common, as opposed to, but at the same time redefines public space. Yeah.
Well, winter was certainly an impact on that.
Yes.
That is right. Right.
In your words, it linked the data to the reality of the city.
Yeah, that's right.
It is cold. Okay, Nemo, the recent storm that we had that brought up to 2 inches or 24 inches to Boston of snow.
Well, I guess I didn't see a big issue. I didn't lose power. Everything was fine for me.
Was this the fault of engineering that we couldn't use the T for 2 days, that we weren't allowed to drive our car for 36 hours?
So I think it's symptomatic of a different problem, which is we expect engineering systems to perform, 100% of the time. And in some ways, the danger is that we have complacency about this. Many of these systems have been in place. We don't even know where all the pipes are. And you saw that when the big dig happened some time ago. So in a way, we don't know how good we have it, right, in terms of the services we have, and we don't know how bad we have it in terms of something like $2.2 trillion of deferred maintenance that has happened on our nation's infrastructure. So I see kind of a double-edged sword there.
I saw a sign saying, "Since when snowstorm as a name?" Which it was not an extraordinary event. From a meteo, point of view, but there was that whole hype about it. What was interesting was what happened in the South Shore, though, with Scituate and all that show how stressed that system is. So, and that got some, press. But I think that might be the one aspect that was symptomatic of a very stressed system, and in terms of geography and climate.
There were some really interesting experiments that we saw over that time period in which people were self-organizing around digging each other out. So there was a lot of snow that came out very fast, and so the city, a lot of the trucks struggled to be able to get everywhere and sort of cover both the arterials as well as the smaller roadways. But there was also a lot of online activity, sort of self-organizing using social media, in which people were just volunteering to go and dig each other out. There's a really interesting story in Connecticut about a woman who was pregnant and was going into labor, and her driveway and the street were both clogged with snow. And so I don't know if this is necessarily the most effective response, but she basically sent out on the social media channel that I need someone to come dig me out because I can feel the labor pains, and so they did. And she got dug out in fairly short order and was able to. People were able to get her out into the hospital.
Inspirational.
Yeah, I think it was very impressive, though, in terms of crisis management from the state point of view. And I think that if we are to have more extreme events, that I think was amazing, and how people comply to a degree. So
yeah, I had the same experience shoveling out with my neighbors. No one said anything about the driving ban. They said, well, obviously we should have a driving ban. No one complained at all. Right. And actually, it was interesting. You didn't even need technology we could have been 100 years ago with a wooden shovel, and because everybody was in the same situation of needing to, shovel the walkway and just get out and see what's going on outside. I met people on my street I'd never even seen before. So. Yeah.
One of the interesting sort of counterpoints to that was a lot of the truck drivers, the trucking companies and snow removal companies didn't have a data-driven approach to snow removal. So they were using a lot of anecdotal basically their historical sense. You know, we've always done it this way. When it's a little bit heavier, here's what you do. But it wasn't actually driven by data. You know, to kind of improve their overall efficiency or efficacy. So that was quite interesting to see.
Well, that's fascinating.
Yep.
And we know that the municipal snow removal now using GPS has gotten much more efficient, but the notion that there are different qualities of snow based on climate and weather.
The one piece of data that we didn't have was whether or not the truck plows are down. So we know where the truck is, but the plow needs to be down for it to matter.
So will that be added?
And so these are all things that, you know, when we look at becoming a more data-driven society, and certainly for city government to be data-driven organizations, that we need to think about. I think that we've had a very kind of simplistic view of what the data can say, and so we've focused entirely on where the trucks are, but not actually how good a job that they're doing. And when you look at also like the rates at which sand and salt are being deposited on the ground, we also don't know what that is. Basically, you measure before the salt load and the sand load before and after, and that's how you know how much was deposited.
Oh, and that has such a dramatic effect on water quality.
Exactly. We have no idea where it went.
Wow.
And just a note on that, Massachusetts, of all the states, and there are many snowier states than Massachusetts, deposits the most salt per road mile of any young.
That needs to change. Okay, two more very quick ones. The norovirus from winter of 2011, it went quickly through Boston. It was considered a public health catastrophe. Thoughts on the role of your perspective, science and technology on that?
I missed this one as well.
No,
Okay.
so that was a job impact that people don't have paid sick day, you know, and came back. So that was a social issue, you know, which you know, so it has less to do with city design, but that's what I heard about. So this is
But there are interesting ways of sort of tracking the spread of these sort of epidemics through populations using, again, social media, looking at Google put up some pretty interesting visualizations where they could see based on what people were searching for, they could watch the disease spread. The same could be said for the earthquake that we had last year, the year before, in which the Twitter stream, the Twitter wave actually just preceded in time the actual earthquake itself. And so increasingly we're seeing social media becoming a direct reflection of what is happening in the physical world.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, one more. The Big Dig. Long, slow, tremendously expensive. Engineering.
Technologically amazing.
Yeah. I want to hear from the engineer on
Strengths,
that one.
weaknesses,
Yeah.
failures, successes.
Well, so I grew up in this area and then left and came back. So I remember what it was like before the Big Dig took place, and you know, there's the argument about traffic, there's the argument about it cutting the city in place. But to think again in the historical context, you can see what was it like before they put the central artery in place at all. You know, the west end of Boston that got demolished in order to put that in. So when I see the benefits that are there now in the Greenway, and it's very encouraging. But I still think about the planning related to what was there before. You know, was it really necessary to put it in the first place?
Right.
When I was working in for the city of Boston at the time, but what I got from the Big Dig is it was really worth to be tedious, in the sense that I was working for the planning department at the time, and there was the zoning that you had to have the view corridor to the ocean, which, I mean, you were looking at the highway at the time, and there was all those, and that has been going on for 30 years. And I was working on Harbor Walk also, which, I mean, we all forgot how it was, and that was implemented like project by project, and a lot of mitigation of the Big Dig was to implement a portion and all the water transportation, and I thought that, for me, it convinced me that having a vision was worth it, that even if it took 20, 30 years within the life of a city, that's nothing. Within your personal life, that's a lot. But, and so that's what I gained from that. So in those terms, I mean, it was very visionary forget the cost, that there's no public transportation in the tunnel and all those things, but it really changed the city. And from a community point of view, I think it was quite efficient, and very visionary when it was done in the 90s,
I think that part of your initial question, when I think of how the Big Dig has impacted local traffic, The reality is we don't really know. We know about certain choke points, but it kind of highlights the fact that we don't have a real-time traffic model in this city, as is the case in many cities. And so I think that, again, when we sort of talk about creating a data-driven approach to managing traffic, I think we have to go through those pains, right, to try to understand how do new proposed development models, physical infrastructure uplift, actually, in a data-driven way, impact the actual flow. So we don't know. And then to kind of complete the loop, how do you actually provide better cues for people so they can make better decisions? There's in a city like Boston, there's all kinds of strange situations where you end up, sometimes it's more efficient to go the other way than to go the straight, it's the most direct route. And so giving people like a better system of wayfinding maybe, right, or better cues to make those decisions, I think will be part of that, hopefully future state of the city.
And on a related note, it's not just about the real-time data that we're looking for, but one thing the Big Dig exposed is all the things we didn't know about what was under the ground there.
Right.
And a big part of the holdup and the extra expense was in having to reroute all the water pipes. This is how sophisticated it was.
Right.
They had a whole call center, right? And they would cut a line and see who would call them on the phone to complain about loss of services. So again, it's this thing where we have this expectation. We know so much. We're so data rich, and that's our goal going forward. But the reality is, in many situations, we're quite data poor. Just about static things.
We're coordination poor, or sort of global picture poor, for sure. Yeah.
So much achieved and much more to come in terms of science and technology. And we open the floor to questions from the audience for our panel.
I have one question. It's for Natalie. Sea level rise and global warming is a big topic. And we place a lot of the blame, at least related to some of the recent issues of flooding, on the Army Corps of Engineers. Some of that blame is taken up by them. But historically, they were our de facto central planning agency, right? They took on the big projects and they solved issues. So my question is, or my observation to you is, do you think we need an Army Corps of Engineers 2.0? A sort of recalibrated central planning agency that can tackle these large issues that maybe culturally we're not ready for. But technology and science is ready. We just need an agency to really push that through. Somebody like an Army Corps of Engineers that can kind of cut through all the red tape and all the bureaucracy. There's money there. Do you think that's something in our future?
Yes, I think it's changing. I mean, I was at a conference at the GSD and someone from the Army Corps was there, and I think it's also, a lot of going abroad. I mean, the Netherlands is just amazing about how they do that. Even London is ahead in terms of planning for when the Thames River is going to flood. So, but it requires a shift in thinking, But I think also the numbers are there. I mean, Louisiana failed, and that was a big issue. And the Army is quite involved. I mean, and the Mississippi is the opposite. It's too dry, and then it's an impact. And I think people do with the best of the knowledge at the time. It's just how much ahead are you of the knowledge? And this is where I think the Army Corps was probably lagging in some of it. And we're working, as a fact, the city of Cambridge is working with the Army Corps that is involved in a portion of the study. But so that's the role of the universities, in fact. And yes, but in science, again, we talk about the data, but there's politics in science. You can take the conservative approach, or you say, a different approach. So, but it's so much work. I mean, it's so much talk and convincing, and and I think if designers also are more knowledgeable about the facts, and it helps because you can ask the why, and if people are thoroughly intellectually curious about things, a good engineer, would go back and ask the why also, and then this is where you can start thinking.
So just to add to that, I'm not sure that the level of centralization is the issue. To that point, Natalie brought up the Netherlands. The water authority in the Netherlands is highly centralized, headed by a member of the royal family. So
Yeah.
in part, it's a matter of the paradigm of engineering, and not just the structure.
Jane, I wonder if I could just ask a question here about, you made an allusion to the point about the application that we've been looking at to try to synthesize some of this kind of information. And it seems like the lesson I'm hearing from all three of you is that it's not really a shortage of design talent or a shortage of science. It's a shortage of clear public communication. And I am increasingly persuaded that things like, Nigel, what you're working on at a thus far fairly fine-grained level is absolutely the answer. That is, in other words, unless you can make it really clear that without having to think about it or be really interested in it explicitly, that I can see what the temperature, not unlike literally the weather report. Here's a compilation of data regarding climate change, if you want, or any number of the other sort of key variables. And here's what an alteration to the environment would entail. And by the way, Matthew, you made reference to being able to see the history. There's the thing that really stirred my imagination on this subject is an application developed in the Netherlands, at the Netherlands Architecture Institute, that allowed people to look at a map of or a three-dimensional model of their city, both with future developments in it, or what it was like in 1920 or 1840, and the idea that you can build this narrative in both directions, I think reinforces the point you were making, Natalie, about our sort of generational obligations. In other words, the sense that I'm just at a moment on this timeline, and I can look at what the consequences are moving forward. I can look at the consequences of decisions that were made previously. But it's all about synthesizing information so I don't have to be a hydrological expert, or I don't have to be an urban mechanic. You know what I mean? I don't have to have those specific interests, but rather that they get synthesized, not unlike the way designers often make presentations.
Yeah, so a good analogy in that regard is that if you've ever gone to New York and seen the debt clock.
Yes.
Everyone, it's just fascinating. Everyone just sits there and watches the numbers go up and up and up. And most of us have no idea, what are the structural reasons for the debt and historically and all of that. And that's really the realm of specialists and budget planners and economists. It's on the same way, when I go and see the Children's Museum or the Science Museum or something here in Boston, and there are these just real-time monitors, what's going on outside, what's the wind speed, and people just sit there and they just watch it for, at their leisure. And to have that, not just being in the museum, but in our communities, in our public spaces, I think would just be an effective way to put science out there so that people get used to thinking about changes in the environment and what they mean.
I think communication would be key, and I think to expect, when we present a project for people in the community to learn in a 2-hour presentation all about water science, climate science, is impossible. The thing that troubles me is I think it comes back to the marshmallow study. And that was a psychological experiment done about children that were 4 years old. And they were put in a room by themselves with 2 or 1 marshmallow. And they were told, if you wait 10 minutes before you eat that marshmallow, you're going to get a second one. Or you can eat it right away. And then the psychologist would walk away, close the door, and watch the kid. So most of the kids, or there would be the kids who would eat the marshmallow right away because they could not resist, and the one who would wait 10 minutes. Well, think of it. You come to the community and you present that you will do that and that, and this is a 5-year time frame, or this is a 10 or 15 years time frame. When you're a real estate developer, you buy and you're going to sell within 5 years. When you're a mayor, a congressman, you're elected for 5 years. So all around us is for us to eat that marshmallow right away. And what sustainability wants us is to wait. So that's the dilemma, and I don't know. That's what we have to bring.
So an interesting sort of aspect of that same experiment was that once they taught kids different techniques for how to delay gratification, they were able to do it. So I think that is the key. It is the feedback loop at the very end that we need to be figuring out. How do we, when I talk about agency, that's exactly what we're talking about. This is a new set of civic skills, a new set of civic habits that we need to find ways to communicate to people. And there's no doubt that it won't be for everybody, but when you look at the way communities are constructed, that there's always connectors. I mean, this is the new science around sort of network, like social networks and network science, is indicating that there are key people in communities that if you can get to them, they can sway public opinion. And I think that we can take a very similar approach to looking at these issues, sort of issues of sustainability in communities. That if we can find those, subset of people that are the influencers, that there's a lot that we can do to sort of impart these skills both to them and then the people they impact.
My question relates to some degree the question, is it Aquino? Am I got your name right, Aquino? Okay. And it has to do with the Army Corps of Engineers and his question about whether it's possible we'll call it at the federal level, to set up another agency. And because of today's focus on downsizing government, which we all know about, I'm wondering whether there might be a better way of getting the Army Corps of Engineers through the administration and other pressures from governors, etc., so some of it's political, to be able to get within the Corps the kind of talent, the kind of technical knowledge that some of you have and others have, because part of the problem is that when you have an agency that clearly has the mandate and the money that agency has, doesn't always have the kind of people with the innovative ideas within it. So if you can create that, not just as consultants, but within the department itself, to somewhat change the culture of that department so that at least part of it, even with all their great technical skill, can also look beyond and pick up some of the kind of knowledge that I see being presented here. So I wondered, both you as the panel and you that raised the question, what you think about that kind of notion.
Well, we're at a university, so I'm going to make a pitch for education. Right? So what is the Army Corps? It's a collection of thousands of engineers. And as individuals, each of them have been brought up. And so there's the institutional kind of behavior of the Army Corps. And there's the culture of the Army Corps, right? But then there's the education of each individual. And as educators here and as people involved in citizen outreach, it's squarely within our mandate here to push more innovative systems approaches, interdisciplinary, ecological approaches to civil engineering. And so that's certainly part of the recipe.
So I think the issue of culture change, I think you've hit it on the head. I think every institution on the planet, I think, is going through this right now, both public sector and private sector, really. And so when you're talking about an organization like the Army Corps of Engineers, I think it is about how do you enable that culture of innovation to be sustained. And so I think that we've begun seeing some interesting work in that direction. This past year, the Office of Science and Technology created something called the Presidential Innovation Fellows, that were people that were brought in from outside of government to spend, I don't think it's a year, but I think it's maybe 6 months of service in the federal government, developing a variety of different projects. But the intention is really to nucleate, to create centers of innovation that will spread outwards. So a lot of their work has involved connecting with these various agencies and trying to plant the seeds to show that this work can in fact be done even in the context of a bureaucracy. But I think we're beginning to see that.
I also think this is where grassroots works a lot. I mean, I see the Army Corps going to something similar than what happened with transportation engineering. I mean, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I was working for road reconstruction in Boston, and bicycle, no one would talk about it, and the pedestrian didn't count, and because you're forced to have a community process, Mass Highway engineers and Boston transportation engineer got a lot of feedback and things, and that has changed drastically. I think the Army Corps has been out there because they have to, within community when they redo a project, and there's a lot of protest, and people are being hurt, and it's not working for them. So I think this is happening at different level. It just takes time. I mean, that's the issue. And sometimes we're running out of it, or there's the missed opportunity. Because if you're working on a project and you know that 5 years from now it's going to be there, but you cannot because and it's so many $1 million. So I think that's a frustration in the sense of urgency.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that I think you're right. I think the Army Corps of Engineers needs some fresh blood. But I also think they need to go through some kind of rebranding, because so many communities are terrified of what they've done, and they feel that they're going to do more of it. So I think some kind of rebranding, new identity for Army Corps, because they're not going anywhere. Right? They're here to stay, and I think there's something about Army Corps that could be a part of the solution.
I just want to pick up a theme that the previous speaker raised. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of technology, but we don't live in data and we don't live in technology. We live with people. And I think Nigel has begun talking about some of the uses of technology to do the communication and the public involvement and cultural change that leads to the political will to implement stuff. But I was wondering if there's another way to think about this as well. We talk a lot about sustainability here, but almost all the metrics and things we talk about are environmental sustainability, and Lord knows if the seas rise, it's important enough. But I was a little surprised that there was no talk about health and safety, about social interaction, about the multi-generational success of neighborhoods. Do you think that if we add those to our criteria and our metrics, we will really begin to speak more directly to the lived experience and actually get more support for some of these more drastic but less immediate kinds of things that we usually think about with sustainability?
I think when we did our first presentation for the City of Cambridge, that was with a technical advisory committee. And there was a lot of question about neighborhood activities. And at the end of the meeting, I say, oh my God, we forgot people. We got all the data, but which in fact, we were looking at the level of service, and there is in fact, the key issue, what we're doing is, for example, the shortage of energy, who's going to be impacted first, and what are the implications from a basic safety? Safety, is usually well funded. It's a key issue. So what are the hospitals? But we didn't package it well. So what we're doing now, for example, there's environmental justice, which look technical again, but we say it's, just to be sure that we bring it at the same level than the others, and it's at the forefront. And so an emergency, an extreme event, you get a lot of attention, it's dramatic, but it has to be integrated in your day-to-day life, to make it visible. And if your bicycle path is your emergency path as well, you make the connection. So I think this is something we're going to be working on, and you're absolutely right. This is what makes people also want to implement things right now, because it's visible in your life and makes a meaningful difference.
I would add into that I think there's a risk of, when we talk about metrics in terms of sustainability, of the no child left behind syndrome, that communities will meet the measure of the metric, but they won't meet the intent of it. So if we say, for example, in terms of lifestyle, that green streets must include play areas or dog walk areas in addition to bioswales, it may be that those are shaped the wrong way or in the wrong location or made of the wrong materials, that there's a challenge there.
And I'll say, while we do have lots of data, it's not necessarily integrated in a way that makes it easy to understand, let's say, the environmental justice or the epidemiological effects of certain changes on a large scale. There's a real difference between what we can say on a local level through kind of community processes and consensus processes, and then policy that really has effect on a very large scale. So a big area of opportunity, I think, is understanding the relationship between big policy changes and the environmental effects that those have in terms of pollutant levels and concentrations and so on. And who is going to benefit from those? Who specifically in which communities? And we're now beginning, because of GIS and very good census information, to be able to say those kinds of things. So to your point about health and safety, looking at it purely from a quantitative point of view, the economic value of sustainability to public health is orders of magnitude more than the economic value of environmental sustainability. So, I think all of us would agree all of those things are entwined, but if you had to separate them, the fact of the matter is that there's a lot more leverage when you talk about sustainability from a health point of view.
I think it's also to also think not in terms of only the quantitative stuff, but I think the qualitative stuff, I think, has also been kind of downplayed as we've seen the rise of a focus on data. We've worked with a lot of different communities in which each new generation essentially has to rediscover all the lessons of the past in terms of advocacy and how to become activists and how to take ownership of local issues. And so when you can imagine the stories that are embedded in a community, if you look at, your average inner city neighborhood and you look at the civil rights struggle there, it's an empowering story, a piece of data that is often overlooked, but I think is vital when you look at that community's ability to chart its own destiny, because each new generation has to have that experience, or we have to find some way to communicate that experience, that you can affect change, and you're just not subject to these systems that are out there, but that these qualitative aspects of our lives are just as important. And I think they are a different kind of data that we need to find a way to integrate.
Excellent. Well, we will close this panel. If you have additional questions, please raise them either in a different forum for another panel or save them for the reception at 4:30. We have a 90-minute break, and we begin again at 2 o'clock with the Policy of Design panel moderated by Brian Helmuth. Thank you so much to Nigel and Natalie and Matt.